Thank you very much, Babita, and a very good morning to you and the audience. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope you all can hear me. Uh, uh, as Babita kindly introduced, I'm Vibhor. I'm the director and co-founder of Pangea Data Limited. We are headquartered in London, and this is where I'm speaking to you from today. Over the next 15 to 20 minutes, I would like to share some of the work that we have been doing with clinicians and with hospitals over the last 5 to 10 years, whereby we have been looking at the information that clinicians laboriously capture through their interactions with patients in the form of their notes, be it within primary care or be it within secondary care in hospitals, and how that information is really helping us extract or find more about a patient and really help them in their clinical journey with the final goal to improve outcomes. So with that, I would just like to highlight our motivation to do this work, which as always is to help our patients and improve outcomes and make sure that they're taken through the right clinical pathways as early as possible. And it's all about have to face if later on in their disease trajectory. As I said, we have enough evidence available today through our work to suggest that insights which can be extracted through this information that has been captured for the patients by clinicians is actionable and can really help us improve patient outcomes through earlier diagnosis, by being able to triage these patients better through the hospitals, and also from a research perspective, by matching these patients to the right clinical trial studies and also to the right drug discovery studies, which is quite profound in the times we live in today. So just to provide some context for the uninitiated over here, today, at least in the Western world, within North America and Western Europe, 95% of data that is captured for patients is digital. It's not just electronic health record systems in hospitals or primary care practices, but it's also through mobile applications, several medtech devices, which we heard about yesterday during the conference, and also through several online portals where patients are reporting about their own journeys and what they're going through. And if you were to read the journals like Forbes and others, this data is rising 40% year on year. And 80% of this data, albeit digital, is textual in nature, which actually refers to doctors' notes captured in primary care, discharge summaries written by doctors at the time of patients being discharged in hospitals, which I mentioned to just a few seconds earlier, which are actually reported by patients themselves through several online and other sort of digital forums. So you can appreciate that a large part of patient information is textual and therefore could contain a lot of information about those patients which is useful. When we talk about patient information, however, in a clinical setting or even from a technological setting, what we sometimes are distracted by is just the 20%, which is what we in the technology domain call structured data, which are essentially checkboxes based information, such as if a patient is a smoker or not a smoker, or smokes sometimes, or it's information about the age and gender of the patient, which can be represented in sort of discrete numerical terms, or there is information about the patients have been diagnosed by, which is represented in the form of codes, be it ICD code. And there's a around. So you can see all this abstract or more discrete information that is captured for patients in the form of rows and columns is what we would typically call structured. because, that's the only way they can be represented. And there's a standard defined to represent them. But the 80%, which I just referred to earlier, is actually textual. As I said, these are notes captured by doctors in primary care and secondary care. These refer to patients' family histories. It talks about the results of the test and the interpretation of those results, sometimes that is captured through the patient records, and a host of other information that cannot be represented in discrete terms or in some kind of abstract term. And this information is what is very rich and can inform not just us in the technology domain, but also clinicians themselves a lot about what's going on with the patient, which is why when any of us visit our GP or a consultant in a hospital, the first thing they would like to do is look at our entire medical record and spend time actually reading through it and understanding what has been noted and what has been written, as opposed to just looking at rows and columns of values. And this is not just relevant for uh, clinicians per se, but also hospitals who are striving to improve patient outcomes, who want to find patients who are at risk of diseases earlier on, especially given the fact that they are already capturing a lot of information and spending a lot on technical infrastructure to manage that information. In addition to hospitals and clinicians, biopharmaceutical companies want to mine this information for patients to find patients of specific clinical characteristics who can be relevant for their clinical trials. So for example, a biopharma company might say, we are looking for patients who have been diagnosed with diabetes, but also have a rash on the skin. Well, you can find patients with diabetes very easily using the ICD code or a SNOMED code that is used for defining diabetic diagnosis. But how are you going to find patients with rash on the skin? And we will come back to that in a few slides. And finally, there are companies today who are actually in the business of amassing all of this patient data and are looking to provide access to this patient data through commercial means. But for them, it's not just about amassing data and sort of bundling it and trying to provide access to it. They have to prove to the end users, who are scientists from biopharma companies or clinicians, that that data has some value and certainly has all the value that the clinicians or the scientists are looking for. So the bottom line is that this kind of unstructured, digital but textual data is very rich in patient information and is critical across all areas of life sciences. So the question is, how do you mine this information? Well, one approach is exactly what I alluded to a few seconds earlier, which is to read these notes, which is what our clinicians do. They first laboriously capture this information, and then they have to spend time reading it for every patient as well. Another approach could be as we do on our Microsoft Word documents, which is to just do a Control F, where you are looking for certain keywords of interest. And that would be okay. But the challenge is that keywords, let's take an example over here. Keyword-based searches require those keywords to be mentioned in those notes in the first instance. So I brought up an example of a real life sort of note here, whereby a clinician had noted about a patient, their age, and also some characteristics around disorientation and confusion. And if you were someone who was looking for those characteristics specifically, and you searched for those keywords of disorientation and confusion, then you would find this patient, you would find that in this patient's record, and you could perhaps then make a clinical assessment about dementia in their context. But what about a patient whose record is reflected like this, where the age of the patient is referred to, the gender of the patient is referred to, but the information about them is written in colloquial terms? such as he reports that she's unable to do household chores. Now that to a clinician might be a signal that, this is a patient for, a candidate for dementia. But how do you train a machine? And certainly, if you did a keyword-based search, like we talked about before, you're not going to find the words disorientation and confusion like you did in the first record. So the question is, how do you mine this textual data in a way which is almost as good as a human looking at it manually? More importantly, it's critical to understand the context in which the words are written for a machine. Because again, as humans, if we read the sentence that you seeing on the slide, we would say that we do not, we have to believe the patient who reports that she denies smoking. Whereas if a machine was looking just for keywords based on smoking, the machine would not know in what reference the first instance of smoking has been written, which is actually in this case referring to the mother of the patient, and in what instance is the second word of smoking mentioned, which actually is a negation. It's essentially saying that, the patient is denying herself smoking, but it doesn't attest to whether the patient smokes or does not smoke. So context is very important. And I hope you are able to appreciate that us as humans, we're able to understand this context very easily, but for a machine to understand it, it's a lot more than simply looking for keywords. Not to forget that there are several other such keywords as part of a patient's record that have been noted by a clinician during their interaction with them, be it in a GP practice or in a hospital. So when you combine all of these nuances together, you also have to think about the ways in which clinicians note information about patients. They could represent the same thing in a different way, which semantically means the same, but actually, could be written in a very different sense. So over here, we're talking about rash on the skin that has been represented as redness on the skin. And actually, if you look at the two records, the first one says, redness on the skin was observed in this patient, whereas in the second record, it says it wasn't. So again, if you were just looking for redness on the skin, you would come up with both the records, with one actually being true, the other one not. So how do you train a machine to understand these semantically different terms in the first instance, and then also the context around it? So this is what fascinated us. And we certainly, as you can see, also understood the value of these synonyms and semantically similar terms along with the context. So we set ourselves a challenge to say, can we actually use artificial intelligence in this day and age to understand a patient's record based on all of this textual information? And can we provide some highly curated, high quality feedback to the clinicians without them having to go through the entire record and each and every record themselves? So in that context, we have been working at Imperial College in London and through our partners at Stanford University in California on exactly this kind of a solution. And we have published our work in peer-reviewed journals over the last 12 months, whereby we have shown the use of artificial intelligence to be able to understand what is exactly going through with the patient and also highlight or extract their clinical characteristics and symptoms with a very high accuracy of 87.5% and at a speed which is at least 50 times faster than any of the other keyword-based approaches or what we today call generic natural language processing or NLP-based approaches. Just to put things in context, in tangible terms, for this AI solution, we built our model in about 40 minutes, which compared to some of those other technical approaches that are referred to, which can take about 20 days or 25 days, is, as I said, about 50 times faster. And the fact that we were able to achieve this very high accuracy of 87.5%, as validated by our clinicians, this was at least 30% higher than what those alternative technology approaches could achieve, which was 50 to 55% at best. Secondly, you might say, okay, all of this is great, so we can understand a patient's record, but what about in the real life? How can you industrialize this? And this is why we demonstrated that using this kind of methodology, we could actually find patients, even the undiagnosed ones, earlier on in their journey. And in this example, as we share here, we found 200 to 300 new patients as opposed to the 20 to 30 patients that were being found through those alternative technologies. So almost a tenfold increase. And finally, all of this meant this was high value being created from the data that already exists and has laboriously been captured by clinicians, and is eventually, this intelligence is helping patients and also researchers who want to use that information for the benefit of new drugs and therapies. My colleague, Dr. Julia Ive, has gone through much more technical detail into our approach and its comparison to other alternative approaches through various workshops within our cyberspace during this conference. But if there are audiences here who would like to know more, we are very happy to go through that again during the conference or later on. So just wanted to provide a practical use case of how clinicians at some hospitals in the UK and also in the US are using these approaches. Fundamentally, this is predominantly for detecting patients early and diagnosing them. We are working with clinicians in the context of very rare diseases and also some rare cancers. More recently, we're also focusing on some specific liver and neurological diseases. And the process of engaging looks very simple, whereby in the first instance, our algorithms are applied to the patient data, including both structured and unstructured doctor's notes. So we could extract all the information that exists within those data sets. Secondly, we then use that information to build networks or models to help us understand the relationships between those different features or clinical characteristics that we have extracted. So think of it like a knowledge graph or a knowledge tree, which allows us to see how the different characteristics that we have gleaned from a patient's record, how are they related to each other, and which ones are clinically significant. This second step is something which is unique to us at this moment in time and is fundamental in helping us really being able to stratify patients with high precision and high accuracy. And it's actually using these knowledge graphs that we're able to even identify previously undiagnosed patients who are actually at high risk of certain diseases. So with that, I would like to talk about the elephant in the room after, which I'm sure is going through the minds of several audiences over here, which is how do we access the patient data and how do we ensure privacy? Well, at this moment in time, we are working with clinicians and hospitals largely from the US and Western Europe. We have started engaging with clinicians in South America and in Asia Pacific, particularly in Hong Kong and in South Korea, but we are extending that remit. And today, through these relationships, we have access to over 500 million patient records. Now, a lot of this access is facilitated through vendors of electronic health record systems, sometimes through health information exchanges, which are these, think of them as entities within the United States who are responsible for integrating health data from across various different hospitals and primary care practices, or simply disease foundations, which are driven by patient and clinicians themselves. And this is very important because disease foundations have only one goal: to improve the outcomes of the patients and bring them care faster and sooner. And it's fascinating to see that these disease foundations are at the forefront of not just providing access to data, but access to a secure environment where technologies like ours can be applied to the data and intelligence be extracted in the interest of patient outcomes. And then finally, like I said, there are hospitals and healthcare organizations who partner with us, and equally similarly, it's the insurance companies, largely from the US, who have a lot of claims data who want to make use of this information. But I still haven't answered your question about privacy. And this is why I bring up this slide, which is very important. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, and we've heard this over the last sort of 24 to 48 hours, that we need access to data to be able to build models using those artificial intelligence algorithms. Now, we at Pangea, we championed the use of unsupervised artificial intelligence algorithms, which meant that our algorithms do not need a lot of data to build a model. It's almost similar to a human who is a doctor, graduated from medical school. They don't need to see millions of patients to be good enough. They just need to see enough patients to have appropriate experience to be able to then scale their work. Why shouldn't it be the same for the machine? Hence, unsupervised artificial intelligence was something that we championed. But even then, we still need to work with some data, much like the doctor still needs to see some patients, following that analogy. So we built the capability to be able to access data in a federated way, such that without ever being able to touch the data, we are able to learn from the data and build our models locally within the hospitals where the data exists. And then in an aggregated way, we're able to learn from all of those models in a central place without ever having to see the data. So that certainly takes care of the privacy element, which means that we are never seeing the patient information or any identifiable information. Secondly, and most importantly, as we've heard through some of the talks yesterday morning, it was very important for us to engage with clinicians, because clinicians are really on the front line. They are the ones who are advising the patient and taking all this information from the patient as well. So we actually brought on board 6 of the leading clinicians of varying different expertises into our company. And these clinicians were validating the information that we were extracting or gleaning from these patient records, and also assessing the clinical significance of that information. And this goes back to the point of collaboration. We're strong believers that I think as good as technology is, technology and AI would still be a means to an end. And therefore, it's very important to collaborate with clinicians and researchers who are on the front line to really see how that technology can be put to good use and valuable use in the interest of improving patient outcomes. With that, I would just like to highlight some of the feedback that we have received from leading clinicians and scientists from this particular domain. As you can see, it's not just about pursuing the science and the technology, but it's also about being able to create value successfully for these experts. So you might wonder who we are and where we came from. So just very quickly to finish, we are headquartered in London, as I said at the start of this presentation, and we are very grateful to our teams from San Francisco and Hong Kong who are supporting us. We have been working with healthcare data over the last 15 to 20 years, primarily through our work at Imperial College in London and at Stanford University. And we have been awarded close to £130 million in funding through various public bodies and pharmaceutical companies to build technologies to manage this data and work with this health data in the interest of gleaning insights and helping patients. From a commercial perspective, Pangea is our 3rd enterprise. We have been involved with 2 other businesses out of Silicon Valley and at Harvard before, and both of them were successfully acquired. And all of this is only possible through a very talented team, which includes myself and my co-founder, Professor Ike Guo, who has been championing some of the most well-known artificial intelligence and machine learning frameworks, which most of us engineers are using today, along with Mr. Jingqing Zhang, who's a former Googler, joined us from San Francisco and London, and is really championing the machine learning models and the capabilities that we are building around AI. Dr. Zihua Wang, who joined us from Societe Generale, an investment bank, and is actually, again, productizing and industrializing the use of these algorithms at scale, because that's very important. And finally, Dr. Julia Ive, who's our head of NLP and an expert in being able to look at linguistic expressions in these kinds of healthcare related text. Julia published a very high impact paper in Nature in May, whereby she showed that using these methodologies, we could actually simulate patient data with very high accuracy, which is quite profound. Finally, finally, I would also like to thank our scientific advisors who are exclusively advising us this technology, such as Professor Mark Newson from Stanford, a longtime mentor of mine, highly renowned for his work around ICD codes and SNOMED codes, and of course, semantic technologies. Dr. Rick Sachs, senior cardiologist from Cornell, and more well known for his work with Agrostat at Merck, and following on from that at AstraZeneca and IQVIA. Dr. Carlos Pittel, who has been in the domain for about 25 years as an investor, is a structural biochemist by training, and Dr. Paul Michael Agapau, who is one of our colleagues now at AstraZeneca, championing the use of these technologies at scale within the biopharmaceutical industry. But what I'm here for today is not to just tell you about our work, also to highlight that we are very keen to collaborate and extend our collaborations with clinicians. So if you are a clinician looking to use our technology to mine information that you have laboriously captured, to build these networks or knowledge graphs of clinical characteristics, which can help us diagnose patients accurately, and more importantly, detect those at risk earlier on in the context of specific diseases, please do talk to us. My email is on the screen. On the contrary, if you are a researcher in a biopharmaceutical company and are looking to do the same to really find more patients than you would find using just structured data, be it for your clinical trial or research studies, then please do get in touch. And finally, if you are somebody with a lot of data and are looking to create value from that data, be it as a hospital or as a data vendor, then please do talk to us. We are certainly doing a lot of projects where we are essentially matching using our technology, helping find the right patients who can benefit from the right treatments. And that's really our end goal. With that, I would like to thank you all for your attention.